I need to share my screen.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to our April Ranching 101 webinar presented by AgTrust. Today, you'll hear from an industry expert who will share more information pertaining to essential strategies for effective parasite control in cattle to support herd health and performance. Before we start, please join me for a short message from AgTrust.
When your passion is agriculture and a rural way of life, you need a partner who understands. That partner is AgTrust Farm Credit, formed from two trusted farm credit associations. Our mission is to provide personalized financing tailored for full and part-time farmers, ranchers, agribusinesses, and rural homeowners. And because we live in the communities we serve, AgTrust Farm Credit is here to help you succeed.
Well, today we are excited to have Dr. Philip Kaufman join us today as our guest speaker. He is a professor in the Department of Entomology at Texas A&M University and currently serves as the department head for entomology. His research program focuses on the development of new pest management tools for livestock and companion animal systems. Beef cattle, dairy cattle, and horses are the predominant livestock in Texas and are one focus of the program, while investigations on improvement for ectoparasite management on companion animals and wildlife are the second focus. Insecticide resistance and control failures are commonplace for many fly and tick pests. Therefore, innovative systems are needed to assist in their management. However, to successfully manage these pests, studies investigating their biology and ecology are needed. The role that biological control can play in assisting with pest control and other research avenues. Producer pesticide selection and the resultant impacts on non-target beneficial arthropods and grazing systems are the particular interest. Dr. Kaufman has secured over $3.9 million in research support and has published over 118 peer-reviewed manuscripts and over 85 extension publications. And I apologize for butchering some of those words. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them in the chat box or the Q&A box below. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Kaufman.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And let me get my screen shared here. Let me do the right one. All right. I think I have the correct one here. All right. Yeah. So thank you so much, and I appreciate the opportunity to visit with all of you. And today we're going to talk about the New World screwworm, which hopefully everyone has heard of. And if you've not, please pay attention to what I share with you today, because it, in all likelihood, will be a pest you will be dealing with here in Texas for many years. And unlike most of our other pests, this one is actually capable of killing your animals. Uh, so who am I and what is my role? Uh, the, so I, as was shared with you, I am the department head and a professor in entomology. My specialty is livestock entomology. So I work on all the organisms that try and eat your animals, whether they be sheep, horses, goats, cows, whatnot. Worked on wildlife issues, even worked on human issues with mosquito feeding. But when New World screwworm first got into Mexico around Thanksgiving in 2024, Dr. Cliff Lamb, who's the director of AgriLife Research, which is the research arm of the College of Ag at Texas A&M, knowing my background, asked me to serve as a point of contact for New World screwworm issues, and we formed a Texas A&M AgriLife task force on New World screwworm, where we meet internally. It was every week, now it's about every other week, to share information and make sure that all of our partners across the university system are all updated with current information. And we talk about how we can help, whether that's in education or in research. I also am a participant with the Texas Coalition for Screwworm, which is a collection of commodity groups. TSCRA was one of the formative groups that brought that collection of commodity groups together. And we meet weekly on Wednesday afternoons where we share our information, as well as Texas Animal Health Commission, Parks and Wildlife, the horse racing industry groups. Many groups come together to talk, and we also have USDA APHIS on the line every week. So we are getting up-to-date information out and learning what might work and what might not work. So you can read all these other things that I've been involved with, including providing testimony to the Texas House of Representatives Agricultural Committee, U.S. House of Representatives. I leave tomorrow to head to D.C. to talk to the Senate Ag Committee, bipartisan Ag Committee, and we are really trying to raise awareness about this incredibly important issue. All right, so on to the fun things, or not so fun. New World screwworm. So this is a native fly species to the Americas. It gets the name New World screwworm because it is endemic, or its natural location is in the Americas, which puts it into the New World. There is another species called the Old World screwworm that exists in Southeast Asia. And believe it or not, it is actually even worse than this one. But this is a homegrown fly, and we'll talk about its history here in a bit. But it is, what makes it so problematic is it's just a blowfly, just like all the other blowflies that you have seen on dead animals. It's one of those bright metallic flies, but this one is different in that it is what we call an obligate parasite, which means that it only infests living tissue or of warm-blooded animals. So that, of course, includes our livestock, our wildlife, our companion animals or pets, humans, and birds, although birds are quite rare for an infestation. When you have living maggots in a living vertebrate, that's a condition called myiasis, and you'll hear me use that term throughout this presentation. And all that means is that you have a living animal with living maggots. So when you see a dead animal with maggots on it, that is no longer myiasis, that is carrion feeding. And that's not what we're concerned about here. The name Cochleamia hominivora is its scientific name. And if we look at the second half of that name, hominivora, homina means human and borax means eater. So the scientific name of this fly truly is man-eater. And why it's so important, besides the fact that it's eating you or your animal alive, is that it can often be fatal to the infested animal if it's not treated properly and rapidly. All right. We've given hundreds of these presentations in the last couple of years, and we learn from questions we get from audiences that we were not being very clear. And so to point out, this is not your normal livestock fly that you might be dealing with, like a horn fly or a stable fly or even a house fly. One, you will almost never see the adult fly because the fly doesn't stay on the animals. It is not interested in your animal's manure. It doesn't come into barns or sheds, and it does not stay on animals the way many of your other flies do. This fly, the only one that comes to the animal is the female, and that is only for her to lay her eggs. As soon as she's laid her eggs, she flies off of that animal and goes and spends most of her time in shaded habitats. When we do find the adult flies in these habitats, they often are clustered, and that's probably as much to do with the lack of prime real estate for these flies to hang out in than anything else. Right? If you're in South Texas, shaded trees with higher humidity are probably few and far between, and the flies congregate because those habitats are rare. We talk about biological barriers, and you'll hear me mention that in this presentation. One such type of barrier are large bodies of water. The fly will not cross large bodies of water. Historically, that meant the Mississippi River. So the fly didn't really move into the eastern part of the US historically until humans moved the livestock from Texas to Georgia, and you'll see that here in a bit. The Mississippi River is certainly a very vast, large river, but even rivers much smaller than that, such as the Brazos or the Trinity, those rivers are considered too large for the fly to cross, which seems a little odd, but it's just some behavior. So where do screwworms exist? Well, the red line on the map here is considered the northern boundary of the fly. However, it certainly can survive for shorter periods of time above that red line, but most of its existence is below the red line, south of the red line. This is an old map showing, you can see the outline of Texas here. The fly overwinters in northern Mexico and southern Texas. There are some places in California and Arizona and New Mexico where it can also survive, but we're of course concerned with Texas. So in a typical winter, the fly will survive in southern Texas. Right, and it has some temperatures that it likes, just like we have certain temperature ranges, but it does best at about 86 degrees Fahrenheit. But if you get below 59 degrees, it doesn't do well. And in fact, prolonged temperatures below 59 can actually result in the fly dying before those temperatures warm up enough for it to become active. The other important thing is that the fly, just like if you go to a picnic, you get house flies and other flies come and bother you during the day, including sometimes these blowflies if the food smells right for them. But you don't ever see those flies bothering you at night if you're sitting out on your porch. If it's dark, these type of what we call higher flies are not active at night, when we normally see things like mosquitoes that are active. That's because of the behavior built into the flies and when they're active and when they're resting. So we don't have to worry about screwworm during the nighttime. So when we talk about screwworm in Texas, there actually are two screwworms. The one we're concerned about is Hominivorax, the New World screwworm, but the other one is Cochleomya macellaria, which is the secondary screwworm. And you're looking at this picture going, well, they're actually very, very difficult to tell apart. And you're looking at this picture going, well, one's blue and one's green, Kaufman. Are you colorblind? No, I'm not. But color on a metallic type fly is very unreliable. So all color that you see is a reflection of light. And these two flies I have on here, one is blue, one is green. What's important to recognize are these stripes you see on the back of what we call the thorax, the middle segment of the insect, where the wings and legs are attached. If you see a blue or a green metallic fly that has three stripes on its back, even if those stripes are faded, that's a fly you need to pay attention to. But identifying these really does take a trained expert. If I have perfect specimens, I can identify them, but it really takes some very well-trained people who've spent a lot of time doing this to tell them apart. When we have color, I talked about the blue-green. As an insect, when an insect dies, it starts to lose moisture, and their shell, their exoskeleton, begins to shrink. And as it shrinks, the light reflection changes, and so the color changes. And our colleagues in Central America tell us that their screwworms they have down there look more greenish than they do blue. And it may have to do with the type of fly that came across the barrier zone, but in reality, we don't rely on color much at all. we do look at is this spot behind the eye. On the New World screwworm, the bad fly, there's this orange spot that you don't see on the back of the secondary screwworm. We give them these names. So the New World screwworm, when I came through school, was actually called the primary screwworm because it was the fly that primarily caused myiasis in a living animal. The secondary screwworm would come and lay her eggs in a wound that had been enlarged by the New World screwworm. And so that's where the secondary, but at some point, the name primary screwworm was changed to New World in order to differentiate it from the Old World screwworm that we thankfully don't have in this country. Let's see. All right, so here are some pictures. We're not going to go into great details, or we won't have enough time, but some of the things we look at on these flies are these hairs that are in this yellow part of their face, and whether they're black or yellow or some black and some yellow. That orange spot on the back of the head, present or not present. On the secondary screwworm, they often will have this patch of orange hairs at the base of their wings, whereas the true screwworm, the New World screwworm, does not. But it's much easier in identifying things if they're present, not if they're absent, right? Because you don't know if this one lost its orange hairs because it's flying a lot and they get knocked off. Now you don't have a feature. And whereas if the feature is there, you know for sure, but if it's not, it could be something else. All right, a couple of other features. They're looking at some of the colors of the hairs, the CD that are in this area, and whether these, I'll call them inverted eyelashes for lack of a better term, whether they cross or not. And it actually matters whether they're male or female, and we can tell male and female flies apart as well, just from their eyes. So this one in the upper left is a female because there's a gap between her eyes at the top. This one is a male because the eyes are almost touching each other. And that works for a lot of our flies. All right, larvae. Larvae are actually considerably easier to distinguish, to tell apart than the adults, which is kind of odd for insects. Usually larvae are harder to tell apart. But we're looking at a couple of things. One are we have these spines that are in between the segments of the larval body. So if you zoom way in, you can see their little triangle spikes. They use those for gripping and locomotion, kind of to grab onto things to help them pull themselves around because they don't have legs. And we look at whether the ring of spines go all the way around a couple of segments, and I'll show you more in a second. The other feature is with the New World screwworm, we have these features at the back end. So the pointed end is the head. You can see the mouth hooks here on this one. The broad end of the maggot is the back end of the maggot. And on the back end of the maggot, you see these two things that a lot of people think are eyes. They're really not eyes. They are what we call posterior spiracles. So they are the opening of the fly to take in air. So they use oxygen just same as we do. And insects don't have lungs, but they breathe through these spiracular plates and they go into what we call trachea. The trachea branch and branch and branch, but at the base where they start on the New World screwworm, the trachea are very dark. Whereas on the secondary screwworm, most of the time they're not, you can't even see them. And if you do see them, oftentimes they're not very dark. And so that's a pretty good feature to look for as well. So I talked about the ring of spines. So between the 9th and 10th segment on Hominivorax, let me hide this thing for a second. All right, on Hominivorax, the ring of spines between the 9th and 10th segment go all the way around the whole body. If you spun this thing in a circle, you'd see these spines all the way around. But on Macellaria, in that same segment, there's a break in the spines, and that's a very, very reliable feature for them. You can also see the dark tracheal trunks here on the New World screwworm. All right, so this is what those tracheal trunks look like if you dissect out and can really tell, because sometimes you can't see through that exoskeleton of the fly, and so you have to tease it apart, break it apart to see, whereas you don't see them on the secondary screwworm. All right, that's enough physiology and anatomy. We're going to talk about the fly's behavior and other things. So, screwworm life cycle. Just like any other fly, it goes egg, several larval stages, a pupal stage, and then the adult. So I'm going to start here when the fly emerges as an adult. It crawls out of the pupal case, which is oftentimes in soil or kind of buried away from sunlight, and the fly crawls out. Notice this white thing on front of the fly. We'll come back to that later, but it uses that to push the end of the pupal case open. The adult fly crawls out, and then after about 7 days, that female fly is ready to mate, and she seeks out a male fly, and they mate. The female fly will only mate one time, and after she's mated that one time, she will never mate again. And we use that to our advantage with the sterile insect technique. So that female fly has mated. Let's just say she's mated with a wild male that's fertile. After about 7 to 9 days following mating, she's ready to lay her first batch of eggs. So she suddenly switches and becomes actively seeking a wound. And we're not sure how she finds those wounds, but she must have some probably chemical signal she's picking up on, and flies around until she smells that, kind of like you see vultures circling. They're picking up smells, and then they narrow down where their food is. This fly identifies a wound, zips right in, and she will lay several hundred eggs at one time if she's not disturbed. Those eggs hatch after 12 or so hours, and the larvae that come out of those eggs immediately burrow into the wound. And at the first instars, you almost never will see those because they're burrowing down into living tissue, and so they're not readily apparent like the picture shows here at the top. Over the course of 5 to 7 days, those larvae go from a first stage to a second, and then to a largest third stage. When they finish feeding, have enough food, they get stretch receptors, and they're like, we're done. They stop feeding, they crawl out of that wound and drop to the ground wherever that animal may be. They then crawl a little ways, and when they find a suitable area, they try and burrow into the soil. Now, burrowing into sand is pretty easy for these flies. Burrowing into the caliche clay that might be dry in Texas is going to be harder. But what do we see when we see it get real dry in Texas? You start getting cracks in the soil. That fly larvae will fall into one of those cracks, gets down there, wiggles around, and then forms that puparial case. And it does that within a few hours of leaving the host. And then it stays in that stage for 6 to 8 days. The whole time within that purple case, it's transforming from the larval form to the adult form, after which it pops the cap off and crawls up. And it gets into burying carcasses. If we wanted to, it's probably not going to be that effective. All right, back to the eggs. So the females will only lay their eggs directly into existing wounds. This is complete change from what all the other blowflies do that lay their eggs on dead animals or animals with festering wounds that smell like dead animals. So we can actually, if we come up on a wound and we see something like this picture at the top, we can actually identify that those are highly likely going to be New World screwworm, because the female lays them very carefully, and they look almost like shingles being laid on a roof, very organized. Whereas this picture in green at the bottom is an egg mass from another type of blowfly, where they just squirt them out as fast as they can. They don't really care how they lay them. And so you can tell often screwworm eggs from other flies. As I said, they hatch after about 12 hours and immediately burrow into the host. It is not uncommon for multiple flies to lay their eggs in the same wound. And then after several days, the other blowflies will come and lay their eggs in that wound because the New World screwworm is creating all kinds of trauma, leaving dead tissue behind that begins to rot, and the other flies get attracted to it. And that's why I said it's secondary to the wound, and that's why I get the name secondary screwworm. So we know most of this. All right, wounds on an animal are the target. What we find, and our colleagues down south are, is that newborn navels, that umbilicus area, is absolutely the favorite place for these flies to lay their eggs. All right, after that, they will target ears, artificial wounds, so castration sites, ear tagging holes, cuts, dehorning. When you shear sheep, you inevitably cause some scratches on them. But even other arthropods, like cattle grubs, when they emerge from the back, if the fly is around, it will treat that as a wound. Tick bites. Even been reported that horn fly bites are acceptable for this fly to lay its eggs. So we really need to keep an eye on our animals, is what you're going to hear throughout this presentation. But it is all animals. Although most of the cases are reported in cattle, that's a sampling bias. Second most case are dogs. Well, people look at their cattle, people play with their dogs, so it's not unexpected that you see quite a bit of reporting on those two species, but they will certainly get on horses, cats, sheep, goats, wildlife, and even humans. There have been well over 1,000 cases of human infestation in Central America and Mexico since this fly escaped its quarantine. Now, I want to apologize and just give you a chance to look away if you choose, but there are some graphic slides coming up to demonstrate how devastating this pest is. All right, so now we're on the larvae. Larvae, as I said, feed for 5 to 7 days. They get the name screwworm because of the shape of the larva. It's kind of pointed like a screw, and people think that these CD on here resemble threads on a screw. But the larva really is tearing at the flesh with these mouth hooks and eating some of that tissue, but a lot of it is not getting eaten, but it's still dead tissue. And the larva burrows down. They don't, particularly the early stages, you don't see them up at the top of the wound like you see on a dead animal. That often happens if you have a large infestation and the maggots are getting pushed up near the surface. All right, so as I mentioned, primarily a livestock and wildlife pest, but it can infest humans and other animals. When I talk to ranchers who have dealt with screwworm when it was here 50 some years ago, the number one thing they remember is the smell. And it's a very distinct odor. I can't say that I have smelled it, but in trying to ascertain from folks what it essentially is rotting necrotic tissue. And that tissue itself also attracts more females. And the female determines that it's a live animal and will lay more eggs in that wound. So if we don't get to that animal and treat it, it is usually fatal in 7 to 14 days. And it's not really the fly in most cases that's killing the animal. It's the bacterial septicemia from an untreated wound that is getting necrotic that causes that. However, if you have wounds that are near the brain cavity or the abdominal cavity, you can get enough tissue damage in those areas that can be a cause of death. The bottom picture here, look away if you're shy of that, is the back of the neck of a dog. I think this was in Panama. It's a pretty advanced stage. Not sure what the fate of the dog was, but that is a pretty bad infestation. Pupal stage. So larvae drop out, they try and burrow into the soil. They do not have to burrow in order to survive, and then they turn into pupae. The pupal case is actually the skin of the last stage larva, and they pull up and separate from that and then stay inside of it for protection while they change into the adult form. It's important to know that screwworm infestations are not contagious. If you have a dog that has screwworm and you and the vet treat that dog and remove those maggots, they are not going to jump from the dog to you or to other animals on your ranch. Where the fly lays them is where they complete development. And so even though this is called a foreign animal disease, it is a foreign animal disease pest. They cause infestations, not infections, and it's not shareable. So I'm frequently asked, all right, Dr. Kaufman, how far does a fly fly? And I was like, how far does a human walk? Right? It depends. What is their motivation? A lot plays a big part of that. So some of the research says that they typically will go, well, they typically have been found to move 6 to 12 miles in a day. However, if they find the suitable habitat thereafter and have no reason to keep moving, they will settle down. So I always use this analogy that if you're driving down Interstate 10, you got several kids in the back seat and it's coming up on noon and everybody's getting hungry and they ask you to find a place to get food. You ask them what they want. They want to go to, say, a McDonald's or a Whataburger. So you punch that in your phone and it gives you the next 50 miles worth of Whataburgers or McDonald's sites. Are you going to drive to the farthest one to make sure you drove the furthest? Or are you going to stop at the next one to satisfy the urge from the back seat of the car? And that's what this fly does. It is the female fly, when she is ready to lay her eggs, is searching for a wound. Once she finds that wound, if she's undisturbed, she lays all of her eggs. Then she goes and finds a comfortable place to rest while she makes the next batch of eggs. She is not trying to get her 12,000 steps in a day or 12 miles in a day. It is simply what is her motivation to fly somewhere? Because it's risky. What we have seen historically, and that's why you'll see Animal Health Commission talk about animal movement restrictions in the event of screwworm, is that the fly, historically moved north, so it would get into Oklahoma, Arkansas, sometimes Kansas every year. But that was because humans were putting these animals, these infested animals, on trailers and driving them hundreds of miles. We'll offload them, and suddenly you have the fly in Kansas. And it's the middle of summer, and that fly is going to do very well for several months in Kansas. It'll eventually die out from winter, but it will do well until that happens. This is really a tropical fly that makes incursions into temperate areas. It is not a monarch butterfly that's trying to fly from Mexico to Canada and back. That's not its purpose. It's not purpose driven like that. All right, so I'm going to skip through a lot of this history to make sure I get through the other aspects of this, but we know this fly was here when the Spanish showed up. The conquistadors have writings that very clearly describe New World screwworm attacking them and some of the folks they brought with them. In the early 1840s, it was described in the southwestern US. It was given its name in 1858 from a famous entomologist who worked down in French Guiana on the northeast coast of South America. And then you see this big red splotch over the state of Georgia. So in 1933, Texas experienced a drought. They loaded up a bunch of cattle, and some of the cattle that got shipped to Georgia had screwworm infestations. Well, the fly got into Georgia, did quite well in the summer, and progressively was spreading south, and it made it into temperate tropical Florida, and it used to survive every year from Orlando south, and sometimes into North Florida. So the fly eastern population did not cross the Mississippi River without human help. Right? So in the 1930s, a scientist named Edward Nippling, who was a Texas A&M entomology department graduate, came up with the concept of the sterile insect technique in working with Dr. Bushland at one of the what became sterile fly units in West Texas. And his idea was what we call area-wide integrated pest management. We're going to eliminate a pest across a vast geography, which had never been done before. All right, so that was in 36, 1941. U.S. enters World War II. All the scientists got dispersed. Most of them worked in medical service corps, where they were trying to protect our troops from malaria and typhus and some other nasty diseases. The war ended. They came back to their old jobs, and we had the atomic age happen in the late 1940s, and scientists named Bushland and Hopkins started working with different ways to sterilize the flies, which was a requirement for Knippling sterile insect technique. So prior to that, they used different types of chemicals. They tried X-ray for a while, but then they settled on gamma irradiation, which essentially blasts the fly pupae at a specific stage with so much radiation that their chromosomes are destroyed. And normally, if your chromosome's broken in half, you have repair mechanisms that can reassemble the chromosomes, and most times you're okay. But when you used ionizing gamma radiation, it caused so much damage that the cells couldn't save their DNA. But it was not enough that killed the fly outright, but the fly no longer could replace any cells. So it was dead. It just didn't really know it, right? So we sterilized these flies, both males and females, and then those were released in the environment in very specific ways to try and make sure that our sterilized male here on the left mated with a wild female. And remember, she only mates once, because if the sterile male mates with the fertile female, that fertile female will only produce infertile eggs. So they're like the eggs you buy at the grocery store. They're never going to hatch because they were never fertilized. So she still does go to the cow or the dog and lay her eggs, but those eggs just don't hatch. And that's how this whole process works. All right, so they needed to demonstrate that it worked, so they went to the island of Curacao off of Venezuela, demonstrated very effectively that they could do this pretty quickly. And so then Dr. Knippling established what he called the principles for sterile male control, and everything that man proposed worked. The amount of time it takes to cause an eradication, all of the things that he came up with, he was proven right. All right, so initially, the southeastern state ranchers got together and with one voice petitioned the U.S. government to fund a sterile insect program. So they built a plant down in South Florida called Sebring, produced enough flies that they could sterilize, and then they did the Florida eradication and started in the winter, and essentially in about 4 years eradicated Florida. Well, the Texas ranchers saw what was happening in the Southeast and said, why not us? The U.S. government, for a variety of reasons, was less than willing to fund a Southwestern program. And so the Southwestern Animal Health Research Foundation was established. We call it SWARF. And they fundraised almost $2 million and built the first screwworm plant in South Texas for the eradication program. They were producing upwards of 600 to 700 million flies per week from that plant, and one they later built down in Chiapas, Mexico, way down here by 1987 on the graph. So within a few years, maybe 4 years, they eradicated the Southwest, and they would do releases into northern Mexico, but every year that fly came back into Texas and progressively infested parts of Texas. So they decided, after an incident I'll show you, that they needed to bring Mexico on board to try and eradicate the fly further. So this is a graph. So this is from 1962 when they started the Southwestern program. And these are the number of cases in Texas reported each year. It's important to note that the year prior to SIT, Texas had 1 million cases of screwworm. So it's way up above the screen. And in the first year, they dropped Texas to just under 50,000 cases. That is remarkable. Then very rapidly, we had very few cases through the 1960s. Texas was considered eradicated, even though we still had incursions every year. And then the bad year of 1972 was a combination of really good overwintering in northern Mexico and probably lack of animal movement control. And we had 91,000 cases in 1972. That raised a big alarm, and it got the governments of Mexico and the US to get together to plan an eradication of Mexico. Rapidly dropped the numbers. We had another small spike in 1976. And you'll notice in 1982 was the last time that we had locally transmitted screwworms in Texas. Since 1983, we had not had any others. All right, so I covered some of this on the previous slide. When they first talked about eradicating Mexico, they were going to do it to this narrow area called Tehuantepec, because that was the narrowest area of Mexico. Well, as they approached that, all these countries in Central America said, well, why not us? We'll help. And so they all had contracts with the US government, and we completed the eradication in 2001. And Mexico has not had screwworms since 1980 or 1991, I believe, is the timeline right in here. And I'd point out to people, it took us 17 years to go from here down to the Darien Gap, and that fly came back in less than 2 years. So this is a fly that needs to be reckoned with. Right? I say we haven't had screwworm in the US in 50 some years. That's not entirely true, because we have had many cases where humans have come back from travel or brought a dog, and those tend to be intercepted at airports. So there was a dog in Miami and one in Panama City, and they did not result in fly establishment. So they moved the plant. They closed the plant in Texas, opened one in Chiapas. They closed that one and opened one in Nicaragua. Then they built the plant in Panama and closed the Nicaragua plant. All right. So in the mid 1990s, they started building the Pecora Panama production facility. This is still in existence. That's pretty much what it looks like. It is the only place in the world that mass produces New World screwworm. It is expensive, time consuming, and quite difficult to do. But that plant was designed to produce 30 to 40 million flies per week, but its surge capacity is 100 million flies, and it has been producing 115 million flies for the last year and a half. They are running employees 24/7 at that facility to produce as many flies as they can. So we went through all of Central America, and then it was decided that this area called the Darien Gap is the eastern part of Panama past the canal, which is in about here. And that was an impenetrable jungle when they chose it. And they do constant screwworm sterile insect releases across the Darien Gap and even 20 nautical miles into Colombia to try and keep any population in here suppressed. There are wildlife in there, but there was no livestock at the time. That's changed, and it's one of the reasons we think that it escaped the quarantine. All right, then in 2016, when I was an associate professor at the University of Florida, we had screwworm show up in the Florida Keys. So if you look at the Florida Keys, it's a string of islands that come off the tip of Florida. They end in Key West, which I hope most of you have heard of, but there's several other islands, and they all have names that end in Key. This one called Big Pine Key is one of only two that have the endangered Florida key deer, which is a white-tailed deer, but it's a miniature-sized one. And it is considered a separate species or subspecies, and it is on the endangered species list. So what happened here was in April, May, and June, at least three dogs were presented to three different veterinarians on Big Pine Key with myiasis. Those flies, the larvae were removed by the veterinarian, the dogs treated, and the veterinarians didn't tell anybody. Well, anytime you have a myiasis case in a living animal, you are absolutely required to report that to USDA APHIS because it's a um, foreign animal disease, same as swine fever, foot and mouth disease, all of these things that we do not want in this country. So they never reported it. And then down there in August, September is when the deer start to shed their velvet and they start fighting with each other. And at that point, the screwworms that were on the island started laying their eggs at the base of these horns, which to the fly appeared to be a wound because as they're shedding the velvet, there's some blood associated with that. And the locals started seeing, they called them zombie deer because they hand feed them, and they realized that there were maggots in them and reported it. And once APHIS found out, they descended on it. So this was probably the best case scenario for screwworm showing up in one of the states of the US. It's an isolated island. The fly doesn't cross open water, although the deer do swim between the islands. There is one road on and off of that island, US Highway 1. The feds in the state set up an interdiction station, an inspection station in Key Largo, where all cars were stopped. They were talked to about what screwworm was, and they asked if the inspectors could look at their animals. Most people complied with that. The graph on the bottom shows when they first started trapping on the island with one of the fly traps, they caught wild screwworm flies. And they did for the first 3 weeks, but they immediately started sterile insect releases on October 2nd. And you can see that a great majority of them, they never caught flies. Then they started catching the teal color is the sterilized flies. Orange is both wild and sterile. But after about 5 weeks, they never caught another wild fly until they had this one up here in early January. And that was actually up in mainland Florida, up by Homestead, which is south of Miami. And that was quickly expunged because the veterinarian told APHIS what was happening. So in total, 350 people worked this issue. They released 188 million flies. They did all ground releases for this one because of the habitat. And they went around and darted the deer and treated all of them. So they did source reduction of the larvae, released the adults to try and control the adult flies. And it cost in excess of $10 million to control that one outbreak of the fly. And they eradicated it the next spring. So it's just to me, that was a warning bell that when we had it show up down here off of Florida, that we needed to pay attention to this fly. So in 2022, Panama reported that normally in Western Panama, they had about 25 screwworm cases a year just from flies that got through the biological barrier. That skyrocketed to over 6,000 cases in 2022. And they knew they had a problem. And so they started trying to ramp up production of the screwworms. They just couldn't get ahead of it. And then it was rapidly found in Costa Rica, Nicaragua, essentially all the Central American countries. And then through illegal animal movement, it crossed from Honduras into Mexico. And then it got into the Mexican population. And since then, it's progressively moved north and went through several Mexican states. Last summer, USDA closed the border to importation of Mexican cattle that typically went to our slaughterhouses or feedlots. That caused a great economic strain for those feedlots. They lost a good percentage of their animals, but it was done for two reasons. One is to protect us until we had everything set up the way we wanted, but it also forced Mexico to sample, to put in movement restrictions, all the things that APHIS needed Mexico to do to try and keep that fly in southern Mexico. The borders were going to stay closed until then. They decided to open them in early July. It was open for 2 days. And then we had a case show up in Monterey, which is about 370 miles south of of Laredo, and they immediately closed the border again, and it's not been reopened, although there's talk of that now. So on the left, there's some data. I said dogs and cattle are the most commonly found things. These are the animals that are also looked at most frequently. This dark red, and they're no longer even updating these because it's out of control. This is Panama, and these are the 6,000 cases that showed up in 2022, I believe. And so it got out of hand very, very quickly. In the current outbreak, so it crossed into Chiapas in November of 24. They started releasing the sterile flies in Tehuantepec, and then it popped up above and got into Veracruz state. And I used to say most recently, so right the day after Christmas, last Christmas, there was a case, a locally transmitted case, not an animal movement case, in Tamaulipas state, 197 miles from the border. 2 weeks ago, I think it's about 2 weeks ago, there was this case on the red dot up here in Nuevo Leon that's 90 miles from the border. Earlier today, they posted that it's now 62 miles. They've identified a young animal 62 miles from the border that they think is also a local transmitted case. So it has gotten even closer since I updated this slide last night. This teal area box and this little box around the red dot are where the sterile flies are being released. So they have been releasing sterile flies in southern Texas as a precaution, because often when you see a case here, the flies may be a little further north than that, and they just want to make sure that we are trying to expunge anything, even if we're not seeing those cases. But there have been, I think they're now up to 1,700 human cases in Mexico and Central America. And I hear different numbers, but anywhere from 2 to 10 humans have died from screwworm infestation. Many of those had underlying conditions like diabetes and some other issues, but it's still very concerning. So we are in a battle right now. So there are protocols in place that Mexico follows under APHIS's control. And one of those is that ivermectin must be applied to a herd 3 days before they're transported. Those animals also have to be checked before they're moved. And then they're also inspected when they're offloaded. We did have a human case in Maryland last summer from someone who had spent some time in El Salvador and came back. And then last January, a horse came out of Argentina, so not the current problem, where the current problem is. It was imported into Miami, and the inspectors found it. Neither of those cases resulted in an infestation. And I mentioned these local transmissions in Tamaulipas and Nuevo Leon. So we are very much on edge with that. Very quickly, when we talk about trapping the fly, it is old technology, and we are hoping with some research we're planning that we can bring some modern technologies to this. But essentially, this is black drain pipe. You can buy it at Home Depot. You cover it with a very, very sticky substance and hang it in a wooded area. And in this plastic tube is cotton, and this person is injecting swarm lure into that cotton swab. Swarm lure to me smells like a rotting animal mixed with like rumen fluid and blood. It is a god awful smell, but the people that smell real screwworms say it's not quite the same awful smell. But what it does is it attracts all blowflies. You can see here's one that's not a screwworm, and they land on it, get stuck, and then we have people that go out either weekly or bi-weekly and pull the flies that are suspect off and turn them in to get identified. So we kind of covered this already. But what we're seeing that's concerning is as we move our releases further north, the cases below really expand, and you're getting a lot of pressure. And now we may be seeing some cases coming up the Pacific coast. Well, there are no flies released over here, and we only have 115 million. We need 500 to 600 million flies if we're going to push this back. The reason this is important, it is going to cost Texas and the U.S. economy billions of dollars, not only just with cattle, which are what these numbers are. But wildlife is a 10 plus $billion industry in Texas. And the wildlife are going to likely get hammered by these flies, and we don't have a way of treating them. All right, so why do we care? Well, you have animal deaths, of course, decreased production. If your animals are getting eaten alive, they're probably not eating at maximum need. You're going to have veterinary costs, labor for people to inspect them, as well as the medications to treat them. All right, so what do we suggest? You be proactive rather than reactive. Learn about this fly. Go to meetings like this to learn more. Figure out what you can do to avoid things that will create wounds, right? If you have a fence that always scratches the animals, go fix it. If you have aggressive dogs, perhaps you don't need to use the dogs this time. If they're causing bites, we've seen a number of Mexican cases where the dog bite is where the animal received an infection or infestation. Animal handling, sire choices, right? So the cow gives birth. If she's giving birth to a really large calf, she's going to have tears in her reproductive system that can very well be a site where this fly will lay its eggs. So it might be time to choose a bull that has lower calving weights. Right? Identify if there are animals that need to be pre-treated with a systemic insecticide like a doramectin to prevent infestations, or even ivermectin at the time of castration or dehorning. But you have to work with a veterinarian for those. Those products are conditionally approved. All right. What is the behavior? Can you work them without injuring them further? If you're going to rope them and try and work that animal, is it going to be causing itself more damage than in a different way of working with that animal? Do you actually have the products on hand that you need to treat those animals with? Because delaying treatment can be fatal, right? So if you're checking your animals at 6 o'clock on a Friday night and Tractor Supply's already closed, you now have to wait at least until the next day, if not longer, to get those medications, right? And management of the screwworm is integrated pest management. You survey, you do inspections, you follow animal movement restrictions. That not only protects you, but it protects all your neighbors in the rest of the state, right? We do have some chemical options out there, but we do not, the fly is not in Texas. So please do not take from this that you need to go treat all your animals right now. You do not. There is a website called screwworm.gov that is where they will announce when screwworm arrives here. And it is not going to be a swarm of locusts. It's going to be very isolated areas, but pay attention to that. And if you have them in your area, you might want to be considering some of these things in consultation with your veterinarian. I know I'm about out of time, but very quickly, this is a screwworm production. They produce massive numbers of flies in Panama. They get those to the pupal stage, they irradiate them on site, and then they ship them up to Texas and northern Mexico, where we put them into small aircraft and disperse them. And there's some other pictures from it. When we do ground releases, which we may do at the epicenter, these are suspended so you don't get fire ants and raccoons eating the pupae, and you protect them from sunlight and rain and whatnot. But SIT works because that female mates one and only one time. We overwhelm the wild population with sterile males. So just by chance, she's going to encounter a sterile male long before she encounters a fertile male. And you release them continuously. And that's how this works. And it takes 2 or 3 generations to knock it out. So in the old days, some of you may remember finding the little boxes on the ground that had, at that time, they put pupae in there and chucked them out of airplanes, and then the flies would emerge. They don't do that anymore. Right now, we emerge the adult flies, chill them down, put them in these boxes on the small aircraft. That box sits on these augers, and then underneath is a plate that pulls out that puts flies in the auger. And as the airplane is flying, it's all on a GIS track. They fly a pattern, and based on where they're at and how many cases are on the ground, they will increase or decrease the release. So when they're flying over the water with this red line or the blue line, they're not releasing any flies, but this way they cover the whole area and they know where they've released flies. It's very, very scientific now. So this is pictures from down in Edinburgh where they opened the dispersal facility, not the production facility. And these are some green powder put on top of a bunch of fly pupae. So when those pupae had closed, they pushed this white sac out between their eyes to pop the end of that pupal case off. That green powder gets all over the whole fly, but it gets on this sticky area. And once the fly is out, it sucks that back in its head and then the eyes seal shut. And if that fly gets caught on one of the sticky traps, you can pass a black light over it and it will glow green. It's the same technology that's in the reflectors along the road that when your headlights hit them, the speed limit sign lights up, or the orange cones. All right, so that dispersal facility is open in Texas, but the production facility is still at least a year and a half out before it'll be producing any flies. We can't just use any pesticide on these organisms. So there are some regulations on that. So very quickly, FDA and EPA are the two federal agencies that allow us to use products. So things like ivermectin, doramectin, Exalt are FDA products because they're systemic. They work like Advil does in your body. It goes all over your body. And so that's an FDA product. EPA are things like permethrin, the things you spray for flies, ear tags and whatnot. Those are surface active compounds. Very important. So what we know from our colleagues in Latin America is if you take care of your animals and have well-managed operations, you have fewer problems with screwworm. They have dealt with screwworm in South America forever, and they still produce a lot of beef. They just have to be careful and recognize that this is part of that management plan. They treat wounds promptly, prevent wounds, do things differently. So many people come up to me and say, I remember all these products we had in the 60s to treat livestock. And so I went and pulled those products. Every one of them has been canceled, mainly because they contain compounds that we do not want used on our animals anymore. But thankfully, we have a number of new products that are even better than those. Ivermectin, doramectin, Exalt, which is fluorolaner, pyrethroids, permethrin. All those products came out after we had screwworm in this country. And we are working with EPA and FDA to try and bring many new products to market so that you have more options. So you can watch your animals, and sometimes with behavior, you can see that there's something wrong with them. They're just not acting right. Take a closer look. If you smell decay, but the animal's alive, that's a pretty good clue. And obviously, if you see maggots, you better get that animal in and get them looked at by a veterinarian. All right, so USDA is renovating with Mexico a fruit fly plant down in Matapa, which is in Chiapas. They hope to produce 100 million flies toward the end of this year, which will add to the 115 million flies. So we are hoping to double production later this year. And then next summer of 27, we expect the production facility in Edinburgh to be producing its first 100 million flies, and then a year later to add 200 million more. At that point is when I think we'll be able to start re-eradicating this fly. But we have to manage that until that point in time. So make sure that if you're using a pesticide, it is registered for New World screwworm. I have some sites on here. I'm going to skip these because we're out of time. But one I do want to point out is ivermectin has been thrown around left and right. Our colleagues in South America tell us ivermectin on an existing screwworm infestation is worthless. It works more as a preventative. So if you're calving and you're going to give your calf some things and screwworm is in the area, and that's absolutely critical, you might consider having your vet authorize giving them an ivermectin shot, because that will last a couple of weeks and prevent any infestation. Fluorolaner is one that's come on. recently. It's a very good product. The 98-day withdrawal just got cut to 44 days if you are in an area that has temperatures never drop below 60 degrees Fahrenheit for the duration of that 44 days. So there's a new label out for Fluralaner, but you can always go to FDA and they will have all the products that are approved. And cats and dogs, we have a lot of options because they're not food animals in this country. So Lottolaner and Afoxolaner are similar to Fluralaner, which is what's in Exalt. Those products are approved for cats and dogs. What we're missing are products for swine and dairy, lactating dairy, and some others, but those are coming. I suggest everyone develop a disaster management plan for New World screwworm. What do you need to do? What are you going to do if it shows up? You have them for hurricanes, for wildfires, develop one for New World screwworm. And your county agent extension agent will probably be happy to work with you on those. Watch your animals, keep your wounds clean and covered, and make sure you inspect your things before your vehicles and whatnot for pests, especially if you're coming in and out of those screwworm infested areas that we do not have in Texas yet. And if, for goodness sakes, if you have an animal you suspect has screwworm, do not put them on a trailer and drive them somewhere, because now you're just expanding where we're going to have to do sterile fly releases. Get the veterinarian to come to your ranch. Do not take the animal to town. All right, your primary point of contact, if you think you have something, is Texas Animal Health Commission. If it's in wildlife, contact Parks and Wildlife. Different states have different groups you contact, but notify your private vet and make sure you have a vet on contract with you. That's one of our shortcomings, is we don't have a lot of vets in many large animal vets in rural areas. All right, help is on the way. USDA is funding a Grand Challenge grant, but that's going to be research, some of which will take a little while. We just need to be cognizant of what the future has for us. So you're welcome to take a snapshot of this. I think they're going to make slides available later, but these are a bunch of websites that have screwworm information. Our AgriLife one, this is a link to a landing page which has a bunch of pubs, and you're welcome to any of those on there. And the coalition has their own. But I will say the screwworm.gov, which I guess I didn't include on here, is the place where they will announce. Yeah, it's up here at the top. They will announce if screwworm shows up. Their map gets updated every Tuesday and Thursday, and so you can always see where the most recent cases are. But that is the official place where if screwworm shows up, it will be announced. Not social media, not anywhere else. So you can ignore some of those things. And this is just a picture of the AgriLife landing page, but you can go there and see that yourself. And with that, I am more than happy to take any questions. I know I went a little bit over. I apologize for that.
No, you're good. Thank you, Dr. Kaufman. So you do have time for a few questions. I know you've got a tight schedule today and want to respect the time.
I'll drive faster.
Okay. Well, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and it does look like we have a few, so I'll run through them quickly for you. I've gone from cutting calves to banding them. Is this a better option?
It probably is a better option. It still will maybe create a small wound for a short time, but it certainly is going to be a smaller wound. And I would just kind of watch those animals. If it heals off well with a scab, it should be fine. The fly larva is incapable of puncturing through intact skin. All right, the next one is ivermectin treatment by injectable. So I believe there's only one formulation of ivermectin that's been approved, and it is an injectable form, but it has to be given. It's conditionally approved, as is doramectin, and those have to be given either by a vet or under the direction of a veterinarian. Does the use of iodine on wounds help prevent the eggs from development? Iodine's likely not going to stop eggs from hatching. Um, I like when we do research and we have an animal with a cut, we use that Illuma spray stuff. Sometimes the animals lick it off, but if it can give you some measure of protection, that would be something I would do. Um, there are some permethrin sprays, and there's one out there called F10 that can be used on cattle that is not only has permethrin that will kill the fly larvae, but it also contains some uh, sanitizers. The word is getting past me, but it'll help kill the bacteria and whatnot in the wound. Cydectin work or just ivermectin. Cydectin is not labeled for screwworm, so it is not allowed to be used. And I don't think Cydectin will have the potency anyway, so you may never see that one out there. Will a deceased animal have the maggots? So an animal that's infested that dies, if those larvae are of sufficient size, they will crawl out of that now dead animal, burrow in the ground and survive. And that's bad. That's why people have been talking about what do we do with wildlife, because you can't, digging a hole in Texas big enough to bury a cow is kind of unrealistic, and you have to bury them at least 4 feet deep and then pack the dirt real tightly. Um, and you can't spray the ground with permethrin. That's an illegal application. And so we don't have a lot of options there. But what we're telling people is if you suspect that it's screwworm and you have a Ziploc bag or something, throw all the maggots that you can into that bag and put it in the freezer until they're dead. Or if you really suspect that the animal may have had that before they died, I would put some alcohol in with those and get them to somebody at Animal Health Commission, and then we can have folks take a look at those and make sure that there are no screwworms in there. The other thing that happens is when these maggots get big enough, and we call it the post-feeding stage or the wandering, they wander away from the host. They actually have started to turn into pupae, and we have our brain, and our spine, which is our central nervous system. Then you have all your nerves that go out to your fingers that let you feel things. Insects will, let me put that. I don't know if I can see both, but let me see. So you may have to read me the questions if I reshare this up.
That's okay.
And so once the insects leave the animal, they sever those peripheral nervous connections, and things like permethrin no longer kill the fly. And so that's why we don't want to see people spraying the ground, because it isn't going to work anyway, and it's an illegal application. Okay, the spray I mentioned for cuts it's F as in Frank -1010, F10. I do not know who's selling it. It just got approved about 2 weeks ago, but it includes some antiseptics in there as well as permethrin. And it would be something, the permethrin should give you a few days of control at least. But again, keep an eye on these animals as best you can. It's been 30 years since I had cattle, and I know I didn't have them on the range sizes you guys are dealing with. But if you know you're having calves or cows give birth, and you have the ability to hold them somewhere where they're a little more accessible to you, I would do that so that you can at least get out there with them without having to ride 6 sections and look for them. And putting eyes on them is the best thing you can do, because if you know you have a problem, then you know you have something to try and work on to try and save those animals. But if you're in South Texas, I would read up as much on this as you can and start making sure you have a disaster management plan of what you're going to do, who you're going to call. If you don't have a veterinarian, you need to get one now, because you are not going to be able to use these products without a veterinarian signing off on it. And a lot of vets probably are not going to be all too eager to just sign a piece of paper for you when they've never worked your animals before. And we are getting collection kits prepared and distributed to our county agents in South Texas in particular. I think Southwest Cattle Raisers is going to get a number of them pretty soon, so that if you do get maggots, you know how to collect them and ship them in to get identified. And you absolutely, the only way we're going to stomp this out if it shows up in Texas is if ranchers tell, or whomever sees it tells us they have them, because you will be the first place that gets the sterile flies dropped on you. This is not the fever tick where they're going to put in a quarantine that takes you 2 years to get out of. This is a stop animal movement so that Animal Health Commission can get their people in place and best manage a situation before it gets out of hand. And this fly does not care about your fence line. And if you don't say something, it's going to proliferate, and then it's going to move to your neighbors. And then now we have a county-wide issue, and it becomes harder and harder to manage. And we simply do not have the flies to do a cross Texas management of this pest. We need everybody on board with this one. And but I will tell you, the scientific community is lined up behind all of you and trying to find better solutions. And I just had one of my faculty come back from Panama to learn more about how they grow the flies. Yeah, so someone posted, TR is on here, so he posted a link in there. I don't know if everybody can see that or if it needs to get moved to the chat.
It will need to get moved to the chat if you don't mind.
Okay, TR, if you're able to drop that in the chat, it'd be appreciated. Thank you. And someone posted it's available on quickpets.com. And FDA told me last week that they expect to have several new products approved before Memorial Day. Hopefully it's sooner than that, but we are looking forward to that. And they really have been very helpful in helping us get some new products out there for y'all. Good. Any other questions?
Okay. Yeah, final call. Well, this has been great today, Dr. Kaufman. Greatly appreciate you joining us. And if we don't have any more questions at the moment, we'll let everyone get back to their day. But if you think of any questions, please feel free to email us at TSCRA. You can email education@tscra.org, or feel free to email Dr. Kaufman. I know he provided his contact information there. We're happy to pass along your questions to get them answered, to help as much as we can. So we just want to thank everyone who joined us today for our Ranching 101 webinar, and we hope everyone has a great afternoon and look forward to seeing you all on May 19th for the next webinar, Beef Beyond the Fence. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Kaufman.
Thank you. You bet. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.